morning, everybody.
Good morning.
All right, so let me get started right away. Today we're going to be talking about a really big F word. I just want to warn you. Okay? The F word is forgiveness. Okay? I want to take a few moments this morning and talk to you about how forgiveness can be difficult, what happens when you don't forgive, hopefully give you a few tools, and then share one of my personal stories on forgiveness, because I think it's so important that we share our journey and our stories. There's something that resonates differently when we hear about these concepts in action in the real world with flawed human beings, especially when we encounter obstacles. So forgiveness can be kind of a complex topic, has a lot to it. Like I said, sometimes it's misunderstood. And when I approach a topic like that, a lot of times I like to kind of strip it back to the bare bones and let's look at the definition. Let's start there. So when you look at forgiveness, forgiveness is actually a verb. It's an action. It's something that you do. It's work. And what it means is to stop feeling ill will towards someone who has wronged, injured, or insulted you. And the ill will, those bad feelings, they come in the form of anger, disgust, sadness, guilt, shame, all of those kinds of things. And the someone in that sentence, kind of like we have a royal we, it's a royal someone. It can be an individual, it can be a group, a religion, a deity, and sometimes the hardest one is, it can be yourself. So now that we have a nice clear definition of what forgiveness is, I'm going to look to you guys for a moment. Please stand for a few minutes if you have ever forgiven someone, are in the process of forgiving someone, want to forgive someone, have received forgiveness yourself. Go ahead and stand for a moment. And take a look around. There are so many people standing right here. Okay, everybody go ahead and have a seat. Forgiveness is something that touches everybody at some point in their life. But like I said, sometimes it can be difficult, especially to start. So let's take a look at why. So when you look at forgiveness and you just start with the basics, start with the roles that are within forgiveness. Many times you have someone who's been wronged and someone who's doing the wrongdoing. In different terms, you have a victim and an offender. So right from the beginning, you have these two roles that are conflicting. They're opposing one another. They're dependent because you can't have one without the other. But more importantly, they're just rife with friction. And they're very unappealing. Most people don't want to be a victim. Most people don't want to be an offender. So right from the beginning, no matter what side of the fence, you're almost put in this defensive posture. Another reason why forgiveness can be so difficult, especially to start, my youngest son was kind enough to remind me of recently. I don't know about anybody else here, but our mornings sometimes can have a little bit of friction, can have a little bit of argument. I have a preteen and a teenager. So we have attitude, sass, hormones, anxiety, stress, and usually somewhere we should have left 5 minutes ago. But on those mornings, especially when there's argument going on, my son knows that he can always ask for a redo or a restart. And I always give it to him. And usually what follows up is that there's a difference in tone, we take accountability for our actions, we express our love for one another, and it really does reset the vibe of the morning. That's what was happening this morning. There was argument going on, and he kept asking for a redo. And he kept asking not because I was refusing to give it to him, but he wasn't following up with the next steps. He was struggling with that. And it got to the point where we were just a few minutes from dropping him off at camp. He got really disappointed. He went, "Oh, we ran out of time for a redo." So I pulled the car over and I said, Bud, we have plenty of time for a review. But let's talk about it for a moment because you seem to be struggling with it, and that's really not like you. He said, Mom, I really want to redo. I really want to restart. I know that he didn't say it in these exact words, but basically he said, I know that it's the right thing to do. I know that it's the good thing to do. But every time I ask for it, my mind gets filled with all of these thoughts that talk me out of it. And that reminded me that that happens to us as adults too. It may not be as loud as it is as a child because, unfortunately, we've probably heard it for a really long time and it becomes white noise in the background. Usually we can control ourselves, hopefully, better than a child in our reaction to it, especially if you practice mindfulness. But it still happens. And that's exactly what happens with forgiveness a lot of times. It's something that's good, but it takes us out of our comfort zone and it really triggers those negative feelings, or those negative thoughts. And a lot of times those negative thoughts affirm a lot of the misconceptions about forgiveness. So let's talk about that for a second. I know many people have heard this, but forgiveness is not for the other person. It is for you. Forgiveness is not about, condoning their actions or that person is right. It's about you stepping back and being able to see the situation for what it truly is, kind of on an observer level. It is not about you giving in or giving up on your boundaries and allowing this wrongdoing to continue. It is actually about you setting healthy boundaries and saying this line you will not cross. And last, and very importantly, it is not about victim blaming or victim shaming. It is about setting you free from the situation. Forgiveness is about setting you free from that situation. But what happens when we don't forgive? When we don't forgive, many times we're taking the actions of somebody else and making them about us. When in actuality, those actions have nothing to do with us. It's somebody else who did those actions. They're in control of them, not you, and they have nothing to do with you. Additionally, many times, at least in part, we're giving control of our happiness over to somebody else. Many times, someone who probably, not that somebody else deserves it, but they didn't really do a good job in the first place. And lastly, all those feelings of ill will, that anger, that disgust, that shame, that guilt, all of that, you know what we do with it? We put it right in a bag, we put it right on our back, and we carry it around with us in our day-to-day lives. Whether we want to, whether we intend to, it's there. So with that, I'd like to invite my good friend Julie down for a quick demonstration on forgiveness. Please remember this is a demonstration. So Julie and I are good friends, right? We love hanging out with one another. We're best of friends. But recently, that darn Julie, I can't believe she said some things and did some things. And we've had a little bit of a falling out. And you know what? I'm hurt. I'm hurt that she said those things. I'm hurt that I don't get to hang out with her that much anymore. You know what else? I'm angry. How dare she say those things? Oh, my goodness. Julie. You know, I'm disgusted. How dare she think she could say that about me? Gosh. Maybe some of the things she said caused me some shame, too. Who's holding the baggage here? She's the one who's in the wrong, but who's holding the baggage? It's me. But maybe I take a step back and I go, you know what? It was just a misunderstanding. We have a conversation and I realize that she didn't know I had that boundary. after our conversation, I realized she had a bad day. She didn't have her coffee. Or maybe she's been going through something really difficult lately. But do you see, as I start to forgive, what happens? The baggage goes away. I'm free from it. We really did not have an argument. She's a wonderful lady. I love her so much. Don't hold it against her. All right. So, now that we've gone over some of the difficulties of forgiveness, we have those roles that just have a lot of friction. We have those negative thoughts that come in, and they affirm what forgiveness isn't. Okay, we've gone over what happens when we don't forgive. What's the next step? How do we forgive, right? So the truth of the matter, honestly, is that it's going to vary from person to person and situation to situation. You have to find what kind of resonates with you and resonates with that situation. However, I did find some research by Harvard. If you go to the next slide. That posted an article on forgiveness, and they talk about the REACH method. And I wanted to point it out because it had a few really good points to it. So REACH stands for recall, empathize, altruistic gift, commit, and hold. You want to recall the situation as a third-party observer, kind of from the outside, okay? Empathize with the other person's point of view, which I know in some situations seems impossible, but try it. When you do it, this is not about you downplaying the wrongdoing, don't do that, but also try not to take what was done or said personally. Altruistic gift talks about how we're all human. At some point, we're all going to be on that kind of receiving end of forgiveness. We're going to be the person that did the wrong. And sometimes we may not even realize it. It could be something as simple as cutting someone off because you're in a rush. You don't realize it. Maybe you did it on accident. It could be something much more serious. But we all at some point are going to be on that quote-unquote receiving end of forgiveness. Commit talks about committing to forgiveness. Forgiveness work, especially depending on how long this has been going on and how serious of a situation it is or how deep the transgression goes, is hard work. And it will challenge you and your thoughts in ways you didn't even know. So commit to forgiveness and commit to exploring ways to forgive, especially when you get stuck. And then hold. Hold on to forgiveness. Forgiveness work does not happen overnight. Sometimes, as we're getting ready to see, it takes decades to go through. And it's not about changing what happened in the past or erasing what happened in the past, but it's about changing how you look at that situation and how you react to it. So also ironically, literally yesterday, I started reading this book, Loving What Is by Byron Katie. Have you read it?
It was my first one on my spiritual journey.
Oh, that's awesome.
Ago.
I'm literally through chapter 1, you guys.
That's awesome.
It is an amazing book. And it talks about giving you practical steps to walk through forgiveness. So here's another resource for you guys if you need it. But also sometimes we think that, especially if it's a big forgiveness that we have to do as we're going on for a long time or it's really deep, that the gestures to start forgiveness have to be big. And that is not necessarily the case. Sometimes it is the quote-unquote smallest actions that have the most powerful response. And that's exactly what happened to me. So, on to my personal forgiveness story. When I was 14, I was sexually molested by one of my friend's fathers. And on the realm of, or the scale of what could happen, It was on the quote-unquote minor side. And it only happened once. And I say that not to downplay it. I know I just told you guys don't downplay the wrongdoing. But I say that because that's an important part of my healing journey later. And when this happened, it was very surreal. I almost didn't want to believe it happened, and I wanted to move on with life as if it didn't. I didn't want to be in that victim role. And what ended up happening is I did eventually tell my parents. What followed from there is that I did file a police report, and I did file a report with social services, recounting all the details of that day. And at the time, I lived in a small town. If you've ever lived in a small town, you know that news travels fast. And news like this is like wildfire. So it traveled like wildfire, not only through the community that me and my family lived in, but the high school that I attended as well, because this came out when I was a freshman. And my once close-knit group of friends felt very fractured and strained, because I was a part of this friend group as well as my friend whose father had done this. And through a teenage version of telephone, this news spread through the school, and I found out that people were spreading rumors about me that were untrue, that I didn't know, that kind of centered around on how easy I was. And whether it was my perception or reality, I felt like when I walked down the hallways, people looked at me differently. And on top of everything that a normal freshman would worry about on a day-to-day basis, I was preparing for court. I knew that my every word and every action spoke to my character, and it had to be impeccable, because that character was getting ready to be poked and prodded in an attempt to be ripped apart in a court of law. And court day finally did come. And I did take the stand as a victim. And I did recount all the details of that day. In a courtroom when the man who did this to me sat mere feet from me. All the while, his lawyer tried to poke holes in my story and my testimony and trip me up. And because of an appeal, I got to go through this process not once, but twice. And to give you guys an idea of age range, because it takes a while to get through the court system, this all happened around the time I was 14 to 16. But the wrongdoings didn't feel like they stopped there, because I started growing up. I started dating. And when I started dating, I felt this absolute obligation to tell the men that I dated what had happened. Because on some level, they needed to know what damaged goods they were getting so that they could make the decision on whether or not to stay. All because of actions that I didn't do. And I remembered what followed and the years after that was that I would have these random, out of the blue, incapacitating moments of overwhelming shame and worthlessness that literally brought me to my knees at times. And I would spend years downplaying what happened because it was only minor and it only happened once. And that downplaying led to me beating myself up and down, left and right, for simply having a reaction, much less having a reaction that was so intense at times. At the time, I didn't know it, but I was giving my happiness away in part to someone. I said, here you go. You take it. You did such a great time the first time in our interaction. You take it. I had mountains, not bags, mountains of guilt, shame, disgust, anger, rage on my back. Because it wasn't just what he did that wronged me, it was everything else that followed that also injured me. I remember that there were a few moments in my healing journey that were poignant turning moments. I did go to therapy, I did get EMDR therapy, and it did help. And there was another moment, about a decade after all this happened, where I was volunteering with Victim Services. And they had an event on domestic violence awareness, where they had survivors of domestic violence give talks. And there was a girl who got up who was about my age, and she talked about an incident that happened with her dad or her stepdad. It was only once. I was minor. And for the first time in a decade, I heard someone talk about those feelings of beating yourself up just for having a reaction. Because in society, we have a tendency to downplay people's pain and suffering because somebody else has it worse. I'm sorry you're going through that, but it could be way worse. I'm sorry you're going through that, but at least it's not X, Y, and Z. But here's the thing. Someone will always have it worse. And just because someone has it worse, that does not mean that you aren't feeling those feelings. That does not invalidate your experience. So for the first time in a decade, I had my feelings validated. For the first time in a decade, I was able to start to give myself permission to have a reaction. And looking back, I truly know that that's probably where my forgiveness journey really started. Because that was the day that I was able to start to give myself grace in this situation. But I remember the day, believe it or not, that I was called to forgive this man. I was ironically at a unity service. It was on forgiveness. And at some point in the service, we were asked to go quiet, go within, and ask what and whose was ours to forgive. And loud and clear, this man's name came through. At this point, it had been 20 years, about 2 decades that I had been trying to forget about him. And for the last decade, I had barely thought of him. And when it happened, if I'm honest, I was angry. I was downright pissed. Because how dare God or the universe or whatever, how dare they ask me to forgive him? He doesn't deserve it. I didn't do anything wrong. Why should I have to forgive him? If I forgive him, how am I standing up for myself? I must be crazy to want to forgive him. So quickly, before I even had a chance to consider it, those negative feelings, affirming everything that forgiveness is not, they came in loud and clear, tried to talk me out of it. And I tried for a while to be like, you know what? I'm not gonna. I don't need to forgive. I'm gonna pretend that didn't happen. But as we know, when things like this come up and you don't recognize them and address them, they come up over and over again. And I finally had to recognize that in order for me to be free, I had to at least try forgiveness. But then I ran into a big obstacle. This had been going on for nearly 2 decades. It was a deep transgression. I had absolutely no idea where to start. How do you start with something like that? And that's when I made a small but very powerful move. I prayed, dear God, I want to forgive this person. Please help me. Dear God, I don't know where to start. Show me the way. Dear God, please give me the strength to do this. And before I knew it, those prayers led to me holding this man in prayer. Praying that he felt God's love. Praying that he had a fulfilled life and that he was happy. And when that happened, ironically, I was able to take a step back and look at things objectively. I wasn't the only one that had come forward. It was his daughter or his daughters, I can't remember, one or more, had come forward and accused him of much more heinous things. And I realized that this man had something inside of him that he couldn't control, he wouldn't control, he didn't, for some reason, was out of control. And that led to me having sympathy for him. Because how scary that must be to feel that inside of you. Something so out of control that you know can hurt the ones that you love so deeply and like this. And that led to me holding his family in prayer and having sympathy for them. His wife, the man that she loved and married, to know that he was capable of this. His children to either have to endure his abuse or keep his secret. That must have been impossibly difficult. And as I continued to pray for this man and his family, to God about forgiveness, I saw things radically different. And those mountains I was carrying around, they became boulders. The boulders became pebbles. The pebbles became sand, and the sand just blew away. My forgiveness journey did not happen overnight. It took decades and prayer and therapy and courage that I can't even wrap my head around to this day. Because who in their right mind says, I want to forgive someone who did this to me? Forgiveness did not change what happened in the past to me, but it did change how I saw it. It changed how I reacted to it. And in the end, forgiveness definitely gave me freedom. Thank you.
If you would like to support this content and others like it, please give at unityoftoledo.com, where love is an everyday experience.